We're going to look at the Four Noble Truths today. It is said that the Four Noble Truths are basically an umbrella that encompasses all of the Buddhist teachings. All of the Buddhist teachings fall back into this core teaching, which is the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths were the first teaching that the Buddha did after he gained his enlightenment. This is the first lesson that he taught. And Tibetans, they consider it to be the turning of the wheel of Dharma. Dharma being, if you were to look up Dharma in a Sanskrit dictionary, you're going to have multiple pages of what Dharma actually means. For today's reason, Dharma is teachings or practice. Okay, so when he talks about turning the wheel of Dharma, that means he's starting to start his own teaching practice, to start teaching others what he realized while underneath the Bodhi tree and gaining his enlightenment. Well, this teaching was the first teaching he gave. After he gained his enlightenment, he wasn't going to share it. He thought that you had to be at a certain level before you could ever even understand this. And finally, the Brahmins came and they told him, you need to teach this. They will understand it. If you teach it, they'll understand it. And he decided, okay, I'm going to teach what I've learned sitting under the Bodhi tree. And the Four Noble Truths are the first ones that he taught. When he first started teaching the Four Noble Truths, he taught them in order of practice. Okay? And instead of doing them in the order of produced, because he understood that if you do them in order of practice, if you understand that they're suffering, that automatically if they're suffering, our mind automatically wants to know, okay, if we're in suffering, what are the causes of suffering? Why are we suffering? What is the cause of this effect? Then he said, okay, if suffering's caused, that means there must be a way to stop that level of suffering, which is the Third Noble Truth, is stopping suffering. And he said, okay, if we can stop it, then how do we stop it? And that's when he went into the Fourth Noble Truth, which is the Eightfold Path. So when in temporal sequence, if you look at it, the Second Noble Truth comes first. If you think of this Second Noble Truth being the origin of suffering, if we realize that we're in suffering, what is the origin? And if you in temporal sequence, the second comes first, and then the First Noble Truth. We're not going to talk about them that way, but after you look at the origin of suffering and then you see the truth of suffering, you automatically go into the Fourth Noble Truth, which is how do you get rid of it, and then into the third. Are you following me on that? Okay. So we're going to look at the First Noble Truth. The first thing the Buddha said was basically, y'all are suffering. I mean, he didn't say it like that, but essentially that's what he said. Life is suffering. Another way you can say it is that life is stressful. Is there anybody who would disagree with that? That life is not stressful? I mean, just walk outside your front door. Life is stressful. Mm-hmm. Life is suffering. Well, he said, the Buddha said, what now, friends, is the noble truth of dukkha? Dukkha is the Sanskrit word for suffering. But in actuality, dukkha is such a wide variety of a definition that the only English definition that you can come to is suffering. Dukkha describes an underlying sense of unease. Something doesn't feel right. There's something. If you're looking at something, there's something about that just doesn't feel right. That's dukkha. That is what what we in the English terms would call suffering. So life is suffering. The Buddha said that birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, grief, despair, getting things that you don't want and not getting things that you do want is suffering. So when we're thinking of birth being suffering, how is birth suffering. How would you think birth is suffering?
You were nice and cozy and warm in your mother's womb, and now you're in a new place that's scary and not warm and not cozy. And then the first thing someone does, I think, is
smacks you on the backside.
Smacks you on the
Right.
backside. So that's a little
Right.
shocking when that's your first experience, is
That
being
is your,
smacked.
right. And not only the suffering for the child, but the suffering for the mother.
Yeah.
Okay. Another way of looking at birth as suffering is you are starting your round of birth and death. Because without that birth, you wouldn't have to worry about getting sick. You wouldn't have to worry about getting old. You wouldn't have to worry about dying. So birth starts that whole experience rolling. So birth, and you're right, birth is suffering, especially when you come out of a nice warm area and all of a sudden you're freezing and got this guy lifts you by your ankles and slaps you on the backside. That's the first stage of suffering. And when you look at age is suffering. Think about it. Your whole body changes. You lose your hair. Your hair turns gray. You start getting wrinkles, aches and pains in your body, your knees, and everything starts to hurt. That's suffering. That is suffering to anyone that experiences it. Then you look at sickness. Sickness in itself is suffering. It takes away your usefulness, your stature of feeling great about yourself, about feeling good. You don't know anybody wants to go out and run a half marathon when they're sick. Sickness in itself is suffering. If you think about sickness, when most people get sick, what's the first thing we do with them? We rush them off to the hospital and we want to get well again. We were talking yesterday that as a culture we've got it wrong. As a culture, we wait until we get sick to go to the doctor, to where most of your Eastern countries are big on prevention. They're big on, we'll keep from getting sick, that way we don't have to go to the doctor. And that's a major difference between the Japanese culture and the American culture. And then death. Death is suffering. Jean, you are in the monastic. How would you see death as suffering?
I have a different take on it.
Cool. Lay it out there.
I think it's suffering for those who are left behind. I think death, conscious death, is a transition,
right,
to a different opportunity, a different realm, a different...
like a rebirth, you think?
But I think death is suffering for those who are left behind, because they are the ones who are locked into their grief.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it depends on how you look at it. Death, you can either mourn to death, or at the death of a person, or you can celebrate their life. It all depends on how you look at it. You can be sad, or you can be joyful and celebrate their life. I think in the Buddhist tradition, it's safe to say that we may have it wrong. Death should be a celebration to where birth should be the mourning, because of the suffering that comes along with it. In death, in my opinion, once you're gone, there isn't much suffering until you reach that next level of rebirth, which is samsara, the level from birth to rebirth. And I agree with you 100%. The ones that are left behind are the ones that's left with the suffering. But instead, why not celebrate the life of the person, and be a time of joy and a time of happiness, knowing that that person at that time is out of that realm of suffering, and hopefully they've gained enough karma that they will go on into a new rebirth, not in the lower realms, but whether, if they're not done, come back into the human realm. The Buddha said that rebirth as a human being is as difficult as a blind turtle that's swimming around on the bottom of the ocean for 100 years, surfaces and puts its head through a golden ring floating on the ocean. That's pretty difficult. And the Buddha said it's easier for a turtle to do that than for you to come back and gain your human rebirth. So for all of us to have a human rebirth, we must have done something very, very good in a previous life, if you believe in previous lives, in order for us to come back as human beings.